Good morning, YouTube. I hope you had a wonderful week with your students. I actually didn't intend to jump on here and start recording, but then I just found out that I am being observed today. So I thought, okay, let me jump on here and tell you that. But it's a really good lab that I'm being observed for. So initially, I was going to talk a little bit about station learning and how I set up my stations to maximize student efficiency and obviously be careful with safety. And I'm still going to talk about that, but I think what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about my observation. It is a little bit later in the school year. I'm supposed to be observed twice a year because I'm now a tenured teacher. In New Jersey, we have tenure. Non-tenureds are typically observed 3 times a year. They typically have 2 long observations, which is like about the whole period, and 1 short unannounced observation. So today, for me, because I am tenured, I've already had my long observation and now I have my short observation. So the observer is a vice principal. He's going to be coming in for 20 minutes to observe my lab on Le Chatelier's principle. So I thought I would show you the setup and then we could talk more about what my students will actually be doing in the lab today. This is the lab setup. You can see that every station is labeled. I've got my typical station signs, and I have 2 of station number 1. I have 1 for station number 2, 1 for station number 3, and then 1 for station number 4. This lab is a particularly dangerous lab, especially because in station number 2, the students are going to be working with concentrated 12 molar hydrochloric acid. So I definitely want to keep an eye on this station and make sure everything's okay over here. But because of that, I want my students to actually do the lab in shifts. And I think I've talked about this before. This class is pretty large, so all the students fill up the tables here. And then I also have to use a lab table over here. This is also a set of desks for students because my class is so large. So what the plan is for me to basically have the kind of this L here, the 4 sets of tables for the students to go and work on the stations. Give them about 35 minutes, and then I'll have the rest of the students go and work on it. So that's kind of the plan right now. I think it'll just be better for safety purposes and the students be able to get through things a little bit more quickly. And then you may say, Karen, what are the students going to be working on during that time? Well, I do have a worksheet that the students are going to be working on for Le Chatelier's principle. So they'll have an opportunity to kind of do some practice during the class period. So while the students are working in lab, the other students will be working on this. That's pretty much it for the lab and what they'll be doing. Then really what I'm going to be having the students do is just make sure that they're comfortable with the content for Le Chatelier's principle, because then they're going to have a quiz tomorrow on Le Chatelier's. So I'll give them maybe a shorter quiz because that's really the last topic that we need to finish up our unit on equilibrium. But for right now, what I'm going to do is just make sure that all the labs are stocked with what the students need. And of course, I'll be back on here to tell you how my observation went and to talk a little bit about some helpful tips and advice whenever you're setting up stations for your kids. I'm sorry I wasn't able to hop on here earlier today, but my observation went very, very well. I thought the observer was very happy with what he saw. The students were very engaged in the lab. It was our very last lab of the year, and it's a great lab for teaching so many concepts with Le Chatelier. So I absolutely love this lab. It was a lot of fun. I haven't received my write-up yet, but obviously that takes time. But I think the observer was very happy to see the students as engaged as they were. It can definitely be a struggle towards the end of the school year to find engaging activities for your students to do that they actually want to do. But they were very successful, and I think they did a great job today. But this video really isn't about the Le Chatelier lab per se. It's more about how to set up stations to allow your students to engage with them more effectively. And so for me, one of the things that I always struggle with is time constraints with stations. It can be so tough. And so one of the tips that I absolutely love to do with my kids, especially if you have stations that teach all the same concept, is to require only 2 or 3 stations. You may have 5 set up, but your students don't need to do all 5. Instead, you could have your students maybe do 2 or 3. That way you can make sure that all students get to the stations that they want to get to. So I would do this a lot with AP chemistry. I would give, different examples of intermolecular forces with stations. I've done this with honors chemistry with teaching about ion dipole interaction. So there's a lot of different things that you can do, but that strategy is really effective if you're having all the stations kind of reiterate the same concept. Another thing that you want to consider whenever you're setting up stations is making sure that you are allowing for the fact that your students may need to complete them out of order. Especially if you've got a large class, you're definitely going to have to make sure that your students can complete them whenever they reach a particular station. If there's maybe a preliminary lesson that the students need, by all means, you can do that synchronously, but I would encourage you to really think about the progression of stations and maybe not even have one, and just allow your students to complete them out of order. So whatever you decide to do, your students have to be able to do the station, whatever one they're at when they get there. Earlier, I mentioned the fact that I was using the station set in shifts because this is a particularly dangerous lab. So if you have limited equipment or an incredibly large class size, doing a lab or doing stations in shifts is really great. It's a great way to kind of save your sanity and help those students that are working on the stations. Obviously, you would need some sort of activity or worksheet for your students to be working on that are not engaging in the stations, and then they can switch. But for me, one of the things that I do is I had a separate activity and I also set a timer. So my students knew, like, at the end of 35 minutes, they had to be done with those stations, cleaned up, so that the other teams could get up and finish their stations. There was one station today that took a pretty long time for the students to get through because there were a lot of questions and a lot of changes that they needed to make to this Equilibria system. But I would say if you have a station that takes a particularly long time, consider setting up more than one of those stations. So for me, I know that this station takes a while, so instead of having only 2 set up, I actually doubled it and I had 4 sets of stations set up for them. And I found the students were able to move through the stations more quickly. There wasn't a whole lot of backlog with their students were waiting to get to the stations. Instead, they were kind of able to move through this a little bit more efficiently and complete the station set within 35 minutes. And then the final recommendation that I cannot stress enough is make sure that you have station learning norms that you go over with your students every time you do a set of stations. And this is one of the things that my observer saw today. I was reminding the students of the norms. We've done quite a few station sets. I want to say we've done about 5 station sets up until this point. And so I wanted my students to be reminded of those norms, and they were pretty well accustomed to it because they understand the importance of safety and whatnot in the lab, but always reviewing station norms. Like, for example, do you want your students to travel from station to station with a partner? How many people could be at a table at one time? Making sure that your students are responsible for cleanup before they move on to the next station. A lot of times I have these picture frames that show the station, like maybe label whatever it is. So it'll say, for example, station 1, and then it'll tell the students like what's at this station. And usually I will include cleanup procedures on that station sign so that my students know what they're expected to do before they leave. I hope this video was helpful in giving you some ideas and suggestions for how to help you set up your stations so that your students can move through them more easily. As always, I thank you so much for watching this channel. I've got about 2 more weeks left of school. I will certainly be sharing the rest of the year with you guys. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend.